This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic, and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel, and the Israel Institute, enhancing the knowledge and study of modern Israel. I'm Dahlia Shenlin. I'm speaking to you from New York. Gilad is not with us today. Each week we'll bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we generally like. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. We're counting on you. Our guest today is Michael A. Cohen. His new nickname is No, Not That One. Michael is a regular contributor for the Boston Globe on national politics and foreign affairs. He has been a columnist in the past for The Guardian and Foreign Policy. He's worked as a speechwriter at the U.S. State Department. And he's also the author of 3 books about American political history, including his most recent, very recently published, Clear and Present Safety: The World Has Never Been Better and Why That Matters to Americans, published in 2019 by Yale University Press, co-authored with Micah Zenko, who's not with us today, but we're very happy to welcome Michael A. Cohen to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Michael, you're here to debunk the prevailing sense of an existential threat, which drives so much of American policy. You and Micah say that actually America has never been safer and better, and your title really preempts my first question. Why does it matter?
Why does it matter? Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, it matters that that America is largely safe from foreign threats. I mean, that obviously is a good thing. It's something that Americans should be happy about and should be reflected in the policy choices that we make. So America has no sort of rival military competitor. It doesn't have. It's allied with, I think it's 7 of the top 10. I've checked my numbers on this, but at least 7 of the top 10. The 10 countries have the most money on their militaries. 7 of them have alliances of some nature with the United States. We are surrounded by 2 oceans. Our neighbors to the north and south are on very friendly terms with us for the most part. So we really face no military threats, no major security threats. The largest threat that we face, I suppose, would be climate change, which is a threat that really all humanity deals with. So that's the most important and positive thing. Now, you actually said something in your introduction about that the world's never been better. You said America's never been safer, never been better. Well, the first part is true. America's never been safer. But better, not so much. And so one thing to talk a lot about in the book is that America actually has the most serious challenges facing America are coming from inside the house. Things like the 3 years in a row now, America has had a decline in life expectancy. That's never hasn't happened in this country in 100 years, not since the end of World War I and the Spanish influenza, which killed tens of millions of people around the world. And so it's not just that. Also, it's our education outcomes are not as bad. We have poor infrastructure. 70,000 Americans die every year from drug overdoses. 40,000 die from gun violence. There are serious challenges that Americans are dealing with that not only are causing people to die earlier than they should, they're undermining their quality of life, and you argue undermining America's economic productivity. So, for example, just on one minor point, and we can move on from this, but it's important to sort of note that we mentioned in the book that 40% of Americans, approximately 40%, are considered obese, which is almost...
I think the way you put it was actually, to be frank, America needs to go on a diet.
That needs to go on a diet, yes. So diet, in our view, is a major national security issue, but that's another
Oh, we'll
subject.
talk about that.
Yes. So 40% of Americans are obese or overweight, and the result of that is that, first of all, it means more Americans die earlier than they should. They have worse health problems. But also the cost of that runs in the hundreds of billions of dollars, not just in healthcare costs. And those are, by the way, healthcare costs that all of us pay, either through our own healthcare or through public healthcare systems like Medicare and Medicaid. But also, people who are overweight tend to be less productive at work. They tend to have, children who are overweight tend to have more developmental issues. So in other words, this is an issue that doesn't just affect individuals who suffer from these afflictions. It affects all of us and undermines our economic power and economic productivity. And so I think that one thing to argue in the book is that we have to sort of think about national security and safety in a different way.
What you're really arguing, though, is that the sense of a foreign security threat in the way we usually think about them is kind of a distraction from what's actually hurting us.
Yes, that's exactly it.
Okay,
exactly
so where did this fear inflation begin? I mean, I find it interesting that you cite a speech given by Harry Truman in 1947, which kind of set up the tone and policy of all post-war, Cold War dynamics. And I read it thinking to myself, did it really all start there? And isn't there a historical precedent? And just at that moment in the book, you acknowledge that fear-mongering, of course, goes way further back. So good that you preempted my question. But what is different about the post-war threat industrial complex in America as you see it than other kinds of, threat inflation in the world?
No, it's a great question. And I think the way that it's interesting question. And I think looking at Truman's speech is the way to sort of approach this, because he announced the Truman Doctrine, which was basically a policy of the U.S. would support anti-communist groups around the world. And he did it because he wanted to build support in Congress for spending, I think it was about $500 million to aid anti-communist groups in Turkey and Greece, because the British, who had been up to the point funding those efforts, were basically relinquishing their role and saying to the U.S., you need to take this over. And so Truman wanted to go to Congress and try to convince Americans, 2 years after the end of World War II, that we're going to go back on something of a war footing and spend money to deal with this issue. And this is a apocryphal story that as he prepared to give this speech to Congress, Senator Vandenberg, who was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, says to him, you need to scare the hell out of the American people.
You need to scare the hell out of the American people.
And that's kind of what he did. But I think what's more important about this than anything else is that, one of the reasons why Truman had to do that was to convince Americans to care about a region of the world that they really had no reason to care about. I mean, look, I think there's something to be said for the fact that keeping Europe anti-communist was pretty important, actually.
Right. So you're not minimizing the actual threats that,
No.
Even paranoids have enemies.
Right. Exactly. So there's, I'm not going to sit here and endorse every anti-communist effort that went on in the Cold War. I would probably endorse very few of them. But in this case, I can see the justification for it. The thing is that to convince Americans they should care about it, you have to convince them, or this was the view of Truman, I think it probably was correct, convince them that this affected them directly. So if you portray the threat of Turkey and Greece falling into the communist orbit as something that would undermine U.S. national security, it's a lot easier to make the case for it. So what ends up happening is this becomes a recurrent theme that whenever the policymakers want to convince Americans they should care about communist gains in Southeast Asia or elsewhere, they tell them that if they don't, if the communists make gains here, it's going to affect us in the United States. So, for example, there's a great story about during the Vietnam War that Johnson tries to convince Americans that if we don't beat them in Vietnam, they're going to come to Hawaii and they might come to San Francisco. Like, in other words, this idea that we have to stop them there or they're going to come all the way to the U.S. And of course, this you may remember, this also was a theme that George W. Bush used in 2003, 2002 around the Iraq War, saying if we can beat them there rather than beat them here.
Right. I mean, it's an interesting point because as I should point out that we go way back, we've known each other for a long time, and we both have worked on lots of political campaigns, and we tend to think that in political campaigns, people vote on domestic issues, the economy, are you better off now than you were 4 years ago? But actually, your book opens with this great scene of Chris Christie at a campaign rally, and the only thing one of the attendees remembers is the threat of ISIS.
Right.
So, in what way have they managed to make foreign policy a clear and present issue in elections when people normally care about economic issues?
They do, and so an interesting dynamic here that I do think that during the Cold War, Republicans were seen as the stronger national security party, and I don't think it's accidental that from say 68 until 92, well 88, I should say, Republicans did very well in presidential campaigns and presidential elections. I think a lot had to do with the fact that because during the Cold War there was a perception that Republicans could better handle international affairs than Democrats, and I don't think it's coincidental that after 1992 going forward, Democrats win 6 next 7 presidential elections from the popular vote. They don't actually win the elections, but they win the popular vote. And part of that's because the Cold War has declined in its importance and people are more focused on economic issues. Now, the one exception is, of course, 2004, when you have the Iraq War, and this is the first election post 9/11. So I do think that Republicans have benefited from scaring people and from using the perception of them as being the tougher national security party to win elections in times when people are more focused on national security. So just to go back a second, because we talked a little bit about the Truman speech, and I think there's an important point to make here that people always ask me, how is America different from other countries? So why don't other countries have this kind of outsized fear of foreign threats? And part of the reason is that America defines its interests in the broadest possible terms, and certainly broader than any other country in the world. So in America, we actually it's sort of national policy, it has been for almost 40 years, to view the Persian Gulf as a vital national security interest to the United States. And that's one of the reasons we fought 2 wars there, because of that. And that, by the way, just for the record, was an idea that was put forward by Jimmy Carter, just so we can understand it's a bipartisan thing here. what happens in the Korean Peninsula? Yes, there are 30,000 American troops there. That's important. But we also consider what happens in the Far East to be a vital national security interest of the United States. So I think it's important to understand that because we define our interests in such broad terms, it's kind of hard to justify having what amounts to an empire. And I think one of the ways that we do that is that policymakers to justify this is by scaring Americans into believing that what happens in the South China Sea, what happens in the Persian Gulf, and what happens in the Fulda Gap are things that actually affect the lives of the American people. And so that perception, I think, has become so sort of inculcated in our policy debates that it's very hard to sort of undo that.
Mm-hmm. And since you mentioned it, I do want to ask, you say that this is bipartisan. This is a bipartisan concept, but I really think that the book focuses primarily on the fear narratives that always favor the right in modern politics and modern American politics, even when it's Democrats who are trying to glom onto those same themes. Are there ever any? So again, these themes include it's always the threat of immigration, Muslims, wars. Is there ever a fear narrative around themes that would favor issues where the Democrats are stronger, like climate change?
Climate change could, although I tend to think the fear narrative plays more for Republicans about, that's been true in the past, the fear narrative that if you focus on climate change means, socialism or economic policies that will lead to higher taxes and will undo, economic gains and so forth. So I do think that it kind of plays both ways. Now, Democrats can use the fear narrative on domestic issues like cutting Social Security and Medicare, which they've used, and which is often true, by the way, but they've certainly used in the past. And I think one thing that's interesting about, you're right, that the narrative plays for Republicans more than Democrats. And part of the problem here is that Democrats, rather than trying to combat the narrative, tend to embrace it themselves. So, after you go back to Truman and go back to the 40s and 50s, after China falls to communists, Republicans bash Democrats for allegedly losing China. And in the 1950 election, they used this anti-communist kind of attacks, and Democrats lose badly in that midterm election. And from that point forward, Democrats decide if we can't beat them, we're going to join them. And so they are just as tough on the Soviets during the Cold War. Remember, Kennedy was certainly even more aggressive than Nixon was in 1960, talking about the Soviets during the Cold War. And then even after 9/11, you have Democrats who join President Bush, in supporting the Iraq War because they don't want to be seen as being weak on national security. So I do think that the Democrats, this is a bipartisan effort.
But is there ever an attempt to really shift the narrative and say we're pushing for absolutely the wrong policies for some reason or other, or is that just simply impossible? They have to always look tough.
One of my favorite stories in the book is we talked about the speech that President Obama gave in December 2009 at West Point, announcing a surge of 30,000 troops to Afghanistan. And he does this in the first, I'd say half of the speech or third of the speech. But the back end of the speech is Obama talking about the need to focus more on our problems at home, and how we need to do more nation building at home. We need to focus on, the foundations of our national security, whether it's the economy, whether it's healthcare. And I just couldn't get past the fact that that's a really important message for Americans. It came at the tail end of a speech in which he talked about sending 30,000 Americans to Afghanistan 8 years after 9/11, and to fight an enemy that didn't really in any way threaten the American people. So in other words, he couldn't even in that speech, he couldn't even sort of say, this is silly, we don't need to be fighting Afghanistan, it's a waste of our resources, we should be focusing on problems at home. No, he could only talk about facing problems at home once he'd covered his political, hide, if you will, by ramping up U.S. presence in Afghanistan. At the tail end of Obama's presidency, I give him a lot of credit, he did actually sort of say a lot of the things that we're sort of saying in this book, that we don't face a lot of threats, we have more challenges at home, that he started talking about the great story about the advances in human development that have happened over the past 20 years. But, in my view, it was a little too late. And what you saw, I think, from Trump, interestingly enough, is the same kind of fear-mongering, but he just chose a different boogeyman. If it was a communist in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and if it was the Muslim terrorists in, post 9/11, now it's immigrants. Although, in fairness, Trump did also attack and use xenophobic messages about Muslims as well at the Muslim ban. But the point of being is that this sort of fear narrative it always sort of plays. It's just a question of like who you choose to be the person that the group that you're going to be scapegoating.
Let's go back to what you consider to be the genuine threats facing Americans, which you did describe in the first question. But I mean, I think the data is really remarkable. I mean, just choosing two of the particular problems you point out, the opioid crisis and gun deaths, and together the two of them take close to 100,000 lives every year in America.
It's more than that.
More than that. Okay. But how many American lives have been lost on American soil to terrorism, to Islamic terrorism in America in the last 10 years? Like 0.0000000%.
It's a couple hundred, maybe.
Why are people unable to feel how these very clear and present real dangers affect their lives every day? And they can only think about how ISIS beheaded somebody, one person a long time ago.
So it's
or more than one person, but I mean, few Americans.
It's a great question. I don't have a really good answer for it because I don't totally understand it myself. I think a lot has to do with the fact that we have long had in this country a kind of knee-jerk resistance to the role of government in our lives. And so theoretically, with the opiate epidemic, we should be talking about spending billions of dollars to create drug rehab clinics in every county in America. We should be talking about ways to help people get clean. We haven't really done that. And I think part of it is just there is and this I blame mostly Republicans for this, there's just an opposition to spending money on these kinds of problems. And the weird thing about the opiate epidemic is that this isn't like a partisan issue. All right. I mean, Trump used to talk about this in the campaign trail. So both Democrats and Republicans recognize that this is a major, major problem, an issue we need to be dealing with. And yet there is just not any of the sort of inclination by the federal government to get involved. And I think a lot to do with Republicans. And on gun issue and on climate change, you really have a situation where these issues have become so politicized, it's hard to get anything done. And so I think that's a big part of the problem. When it comes to dealing with foreign threats, there really isn't any constituency in the federal government, I shouldn't say the federal government, in our political sort of ecosystem that says we should spend less money on defense, or we should have less overseas bases, or we should have fewer global alliances, or we should care less about what happens in the Korean Peninsula or the Persian Gulf. So there's not a real constituency for that. And I think that on a lot of issues that we talk about in the book, just like obesity, for example, when Michelle Obama had a garden at the White House, and she talked about changing the sort of dietary standards for schools. I mean, the backlash was extraordinary from the right, saying, "Oh, this is the nanny state," and the government trying to tell you what to eat and so forth. And an issue like what kids eat would become politicized. So I think that's a lot to do with it as to why you have the situation in which these major problems are just not addressed. I think also there's this the U.S. government is so dysfunctional and has been for a while now that I think people just have given up any hope that anything can be accomplished from Washington. And I think that's a lot to do with it as well. I think we some reason think that our military can do anything around the world, but the federal government at home can't do anything. I think those perceptions drive a lot of this.
Well, this makes me think that something has changed in America. I mean, America used to fundamentally be a country of optimism, right? We think about America as a land of opportunity. That's what attracted so many immigrants to it, and with very good reason, because they really had a chance at social mobility. Your book makes it sound like America is becoming a country of pessimism. And I want to ask, is that purely based on this threat, manipulation and perception, or are there genuine reasons for people feeling alienated and fearful and cynical, as you point out, about what Washington can do? I mean, I'm thinking about Arlie Russell Hochschild's very deep documentation of the experience of Americans, not just their perception, but their experience of feeling left behind. Doesn't fear grow in fertile soil? Isn't there a reason for this?
Well, yes. There's two things. I mean, you're right that people have become pessimistic, but, just like here's one sort of example. Medicare is probably the most popular healthcare system in America. It's a public healthcare system. The best healthcare system in America is probably the Veterans Administration. Again, another government-run healthcare system. So I think if there's a lot of things the federal government does well and does effectively that people don't, I think, understand or appreciate. And I think you have had a 30, 40-year, and I can relate to my last book about 1968, you've had a 50-year period dating from 68 and afterward, of conservatives basically bad-mouthing the federal government, saying it can't do anything right, and portraying any sort of increase in or expansion of federal power as something that negatively impacts them. So if you want to, so on the healthcare debate, I always make this point about the Obamacare debate, that in 2009, when Obamacare was being debated in the U.S., the one group of Americans who was most opposed to it were old people. Why? Because they were afraid that Obamacare would mean they would lose benefits on their Medicare benefits would be diminished somehow, or their taxes would go up. So politics, domestic policy in America has become a zero-sum game in which if you give something to somebody else, you're taking away from me.
Or if you get involved, you're taking away my freedom.
Yeah, that's part of it too. But I think it's even more parochial than that. I think it's just a strict economic issue that like people love Social Security, they love Medicare, they don't want to see a cut, they don't agree with conservatives who want to cut it. They just want to make sure it's good for them. And they think that if more people get access to this, whether it's illegal, undocumented immigrants, I should say, getting government services, somehow that's going to affect them negatively. So I do think that the rhetoric of the right, the anti-government rhetoric of the right, which Democrats have frankly joined in quite a bit, has undermined people's faith in government. And the result of that is that it's very hard to get anything done. And so something like Obamacare, which has been actually pretty successful, is only viewed positively and people want to take it away from you. And took how many years for it to be viewed positively? So I think unlike European countries that have very strong and resilient welfare states, we do not have that in this country, and we never have. And I mean, we had a brief period in the 50s and 60s when you could say it was somewhat strong, or the 70s, but not so much anymore. And it's been weakened over and over again. And the more it gets weakened, the more people say, "Oh, government can't do anything right." So it's sort of a perpetuating cycle.
I understand, but I have to challenge this idea that it's all about economics because, you point out that the world is becoming better. This should undercut the selling point for the nationalist, racist, populist leadership. And you look at all the development indicators and, levels of knowledge and education, rising quality of life. And you write that people enjoy personal, political, and economic self-determination that would have been unimaginable to most people living outside the United States and Western Europe just 30 years ago. So the world is becoming freer. But that is what scares me because we have another episode where we've interviewed Masha Gessen, and she documented exhaustively how the chaos of newfound freedom in the post-Soviet years led to an enormous, gigantic country feeling spiritually lost, leading to the emergence of a kind of neo-totalitarianism. And maybe the fact is that all that freedom is not so healthy for people. And why do I say that? Because some of your own examples are the most painful. You give people the freedom to choose, and they choose not to vaccinate their children. You give people the freedom to choose to own guns, and they let toddlers kill people. Maybe that's part of the problem. We have too much freedom, too much choice, and we're not using it well because we're committed to it at our own expense. What do you think of that?
I think, first of all, 99% of people vaccinate their kids. So the 1% who don't,
but it's a growing portion.
It's a growing problem, but it's a small percentage. I think the problem is less those people and more the policymakers who basically allow them to do that. Because you have a number of states that have passed laws that have said you can, if it goes against your conscience to vaccinate your kids, you can do that, even though it creates a host of public health problems.
In other words, there is such a thing as too much freedom and too much choice.
I don't agree with that, actually.
No.
I don't think you can. I think, well, let me put it a different way, I guess. I'm all for more political freedom. I guess I'm not for direct democracy.
What's the difference? Explain that.
Well, Brexit. Right. Brexit is the best example I can come up with.
No more referendums.
No more referendums. You elect, so it's a thing that you elect people to government because theoretically they represent your interests and they know they have some experience in government and they can enact policies that will do the most to further the economic and political power of or further your own, or just improve the country. I'll put in simple terms, just do good things for the country. And instead you have this referendum in the UK that is manipulated by, frankly, charlatans and con men on the right who wanted to push the UK out of the EU. And you have this result that has just been a disaster for the British and disaster for the UK. And it's going to be a disaster for Europe and just bad all around. And in general, I think, there's too much freedom. I think that where I disagree with you a little bit is that I'm a big believer in democratic accountability. I'm a big believer in that voters should be able to pick their leaders. And sometimes they're going to make bad choices. Right? In America, American voters made a very bad choice in 2016, but they can correct that choice in 2020. And that ultimately is what, and you want to create a level playing field for all parties to run on, which you don't have in the United States. But in general, I just think we should trust voters to make good decisions. And if they don't make good decisions, we have to sort of, understand that that's the price of having freedom.
Where do you draw the line at over how many? You said it was over 100,000. I counted 70,000 opioid deaths and 30,000 gun deaths. But let's say with obesity and everything else, hundreds of thousands of unnecessary deaths a year. Where do you draw the line? at saying voters need to be somehow have their freedoms limited. I'm not arguing, I'm asking you.
Again, I think that's more a failure of political leadership than it's a failure of the voters, right? I think voters have said over and over again, and they kind of did say in the last election, because it has broad popular support, that they wanted Congress to pay attention to this issue, and they haven't. And so, frankly, those voters should make those politicians pay for that. I guess the thing is that, you look at what's happening. Like, I think, first of all, to your point a bit earlier about Moshe Gesson and the post-Soviet sort of chaos, every new democracy goes through a period of consolidation. We did in this country.
And sometimes it feels like we're going through it again.
Right, exactly. We fought a civil war that was the bloodiest war in American history. 90 years, and I said 90 years, it was, about 90 years after a little less, but 80 years or so after we became a country. So, this is not unusual in young democracies, I think. And in general, we are much better off having political systems where there's accountability, where leaders can be held accountable for decisions, where voters can weigh in. But I do think, maybe where we can agree a little bit is that you want to design a political system that doesn't lead to, that I think that sort of mob rule, which is kind of what we got in the UK. And I think you could look at places like California, which with its referendums, which has had also a very destabilizing effect on the politics in that state. I do think we should have a little more faith in our political leaders. We don't in this country, and it's a big part of the reason we have the problems that we have.
Well, one of your solutions, or the main solution I think you propose in the book, is this idea of human security. Can you explain what it is and why you see that as a better approach to governance? Well,
I just think, the way that I would sort of think about that issue is that we just have to think more about quality of life of our fellow citizens. And, that is something that we just don't think about in this country the way that we should. Other countries do.
What does it mean?
Well, I think it's not just a question of like how long they live and their health outcomes, but also like the level of anxiety they deal with, their financial well-being. There's this, I was talking about this a few weeks ago. We're the only Western country that does not have paid family leave. We have unpaid family leave, but not paid family leave. And this, look, I think this is bad economically. You want to encourage people to take time off when they have kids and to, or if they have a family member who's sick, and you want them to be sort of anxious about their jobs if they choose to do that. And I think that like not having a policy like that in place, it doesn't just hurt people, it undermines the economy. Right? If you like literally have to go into your savings, or you have to lose your job because you have you're a parent who is sick, or you have a kid, that's just bad for the economy. It's bad for the country in general. And I do think that we don't care about the impact that not having paid family leave, not giving parents time off for their kids, has on the society as a whole. I read something last night. It's just sort of fascinating to me about sort of doctors in sort of rural Appalachias in Kentucky or so, who listed one of the things that's happened in America in the last couple of years is disability payments have gone up. More people are qualifying for disability payments. It's called SSI. And there's an example that this author used about, and it's actually Greg Easterbrook's book, which is fantastic about why things are getting better. But he also has a sort of pessimistic view of what's happening in the United States. And he makes this point that there's doctors I think it was in Kentucky, who would basically consider a patient who had a high school education, no college education, and was overweight to be disabled, because in his view, no one was going to hire that person for a job. And that tells you something. Like if you literally if you graduate from high school and you were, inordinately overweight, your chances of economic success in this country are incredibly slim. And that is a failure of our imagination and a failure of how we think about the value of each individual. If you don't prize people getting good educations, going to college if need be, going to a trade school, to a technical school.
And having good health services.
And if you don't consider having good health services, if you don't consider what they eat to be critical issues, then you have a whole generation of people who literally cannot make it in American society. They have no hope really, or very little hope, of rising up the economic ladder. And so what that means is that their lives are going to be ones of poverty, of anxiety, and they're going to have children who are going to be similarly poor and similarly have similar economic anxieties and cultural anxieties. And I think that is a factor we're just not talking about enough. And so that's one of the reasons why we have such inequality in this country. But it's an incredibly important issue that I think affects not just those individuals, but all of us. Because all of us in some ways pay for that. We pay through it through Medicaid and Medicare. We pay through it by having an economy that's nowhere near as productive as is the case in other advanced economies.
Well, let me ask you, I mean, the whole thesis of your book, in a way, is that people are so enthralled by the fear rhetoric of these external threats that it's very hard for them to focus on their domestic threats. So how do we dial it down? I mean, this human security approach sounds like a great idea to me, but if people are fixated on, we have to stop immigration and stop Muslims from entering this country and ISIS, how do we dial down that rhetoric and make such an enormous emotional, mental, psychological, perceptual shift to people rethinking what the real threats against them are?
I mean, it begins to a large extent with political leadership. Look, last year, the Congress passed a budget that I think it was $65 billion more in defense spending that both Democrats and Republicans went along with. And Democrats did it because it was a way to get money for other initiatives and other things they wanted to do. And also, I'm sure a lot of them just felt like, well, this is, okay, I'll give them some more money, and that way I won't have to be, no one's going to call me weak on security if I run for president in 2020. The problem is that it just increases the perception among Americans that we need a $600 billion military. We don't.
It's a self-reinforcing cycle.
Exactly.
And what is it? Does it just take one bold candidate or leader to break that? Is that all it takes?
It takes more than that, because there's a whole, it's in the book, there's a whole infrastructure dedicated to convince people that they have lots to be afraid of.
And it's an infrastructure that you talk about that includes lots of different actors.
Lots of different actors. I mean, both inside and outside of government. But I do think that there is a real failure on the part of both political parties to tamp down these kind of fears of these outside fears of foreign threats. But look, we could still have a $600 billion military and spend money on having paid family leave, on giving health care to every American, on improving educational system.
You're saying it's not an either or?
It doesn't have to be an either or. I mean, we just gave a $1.5 trillion tax cut to the wealthiest Americans. I mean, a fraction of that money could. I mean, we have all these numbers in the book about this, but a third of that could have been basically used to upgrade almost all of American infrastructure, which is not in great shape. Having just taken the Amtrak back from D.C. Yesterday, I can once again speak to how inadequate American infrastructure is compared to foreign countries. And, we do need a greater focus on our domestic economy. And there just hasn't been in Washington for 30 or 40 years.
But how do you get people to stop living in fear? Aren't all human societies, in a way, based on this idea that we have an external enemy, an external threat? It's what keeps us sort of cohesive. No? Tell me
Other countries don't obsess over external threats. They don't. European countries don't obsess over external threats. They worry about what's happening to people at home. No, this is a very much of an American phenomenon. And look, we had in the 50s and 60s in this country, we were on a war footing with the Soviets. We still found ways to spend monies on a national highway system, on secondary education. In the 60s, we created Medicare and Medicaid. So, no, you can actually do these things. I mean, I want to be clear on this point. I think it's important. It's not an either-or conversation. I mean, I think the book kind of sets it up that way, and I understand it's become an either-or conversation in the way we think about these things. But it doesn't have to be. We can have a strong military. We can be a strong international actor, play a role around the world, which I think we should, and still think about the problems we have at home and deal with them.
And let me disagree with you about Europe. Of course they have the sense of an external threat, because that's why we see the rise of national populist parties. They're all running on an anti-immigration platform. But this confirms your ultimate point that you can do both, because they also have strong social welfare systems and not as much.
But they're not going out there spending all this money on the military. In fact, the opposite. They're spending less money on the military, right? And this is one of the great oddities of international politics, is that we spend all this money to protect Europe from the Russians or whoever else. The Russians, I suppose, in those parts. The people actually protecting the Europeans spend less than we do, because they don't see it as much of a threat, and because they know we're going to take care of it. If they thought it was as big a threat as we did, they might spend the money for it. So an external threat about immigrants, it's actually, I would argue, it's more of an internal issue, right? It's more of they're fearful people will come in and will change the culture and cause crime or whatever other right-wing rhetoric they want to buy into with that. But for us, it's about, they don't worry in Paris about North Korea's nuclear program. They don't worry about Iran getting a nuclear bomb. They don't want to see Iran get a nuclear bomb, but they're not going to sort of increase their defense budget to deal with that. We will in this country. But
you're saying things could be better, and that's what I like about your book. There's a lot of practical and hopeful guidance in it. That's Michael A. Cohen talking about his book, co-written with Micah Zenko. The book is called Clear and Present Safety: The World Has Never Been Better and Why That Matters to Americans. Thank you for being on the show.
My pleasure.
And thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, and Itai Shelem and Georgia Foscarini, our producers, and to the Van Leer Institute and the Israel Institute for their generous support. Now a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like to ask you to please consider us writing a review. Favorable or critical, we like all kinds. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive with over 500 interviews. Like us on Facebook. Follow me and Gilad on Twitter. Join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.